All right, I think we're going to get started. I'm going to share my screen here in just 1 second. Here we go. All right, welcome again, everybody. We're really excited to have you here. I am always pleased to have an opportunity to talk with agency owners about things on their mind, and a lot of the time it is about everything that leads up to the work that you do for the client relationship. Today, though, we're going to really focus on the work itself and
I have
the
a session
compliance of
too.
the work with the relevant marketing rules and regulations on a selective basis. We don't have time to go through all of them, but we're looking forward to this conversation, and I am especially looking forward to sharing the stage with Samantha Jordan, who is, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Samantha, but Samantha runs point on many of these issues for agencies here at our firm, and we are going to tag team today's content and also Q&A. So, Samantha, why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay. Hi, everyone. To those of you who I've met before, good to see you. And those I have not, look forward to talking with you today. Like Sharon said, I do a lot of this work for our firm. I've been doing it for many years now, and happily so. It's one of the more exciting parts of what we do because it moves fast. As y'all know, there's always something new popping up. So I'm based in Dallas, Texas, and yeah, I'm happy to be here today.
And I'm happy to have the stage with you. And I'm Sharon Torek. I'm the founder of Torek Law, and our firm helps agencies like yours with IP, contract development negotiation, and marketing regulation compliance, which is going to be the focus of today's conversation. So I always like to give everybody a lay of the land before we get started, so that we sort of set your expectations. We're going to be moving at a really fast pace, just to warn you all, because the most important part of today's conversation is the answering of any questions that you might have come with or that you might have after we share a bit of content with you. So, what we'll cover today is we have selected five of what we sort of perceive as the most frequently occurring, asked about, or hottest topics on the minds of regulators when it comes to the campaigns and the concepts you put out into the world. Secondly, we're going to talk about what you all are interested in, which is reducing your legal risk when you put these campaigns together and out into the world for your clients. And then third, we want to give you some tips and pointers about contract language you should be considering in your agreements with your clients and the rest of the world, as well as the conversations and discussions you have with your clients about these issues when they come up, because that can be an awkward part of the workflow, and it can also feel like it causes snags along the road from a timing or a financial perspective. So those are the three areas of coverage for today's conversation. And as I said, we are Toric Law. We do business in your industry as legal and creative, and we help U.S. Marketing service firms protect their assets, turn their IP into revenue in these three areas: IP, contracts, and marketing regulation compliance. So I wanted to first set the stage to let you know that the Federal Trade Commission is really still what we consider, as lawyers who work in the industry, sort of the big playing field in terms of the most commonly occurring regulations you might think of when it comes to putting work out into the world. Fair advertising rules and principles, disclosures, claims evaluation. But they are not the only game in town. And we want to mention this to you because much of what you're going to hear today is this trend towards many states enacting their own sets of rules and laws with respect to certain um, advertising tactics that many of you engage in, whether it's direct response marketing, whether it is influencer marketing, whether it's the use of AI. And data privacy at this point in the United States is completely regulated state to state. We have no federal standard at this point. So the feds are not the only game in town, but we still look to the Federal Trade Commission for its overall guidance about compliance when it comes to advertising. I want to also remind you, secondly, that advertising continues to be a greatly self-regulated industry. This is for lots of historic reasons, most of which is that it's much easier to voluntarily regulate yourself instead of having regulation imposed upon you. And so the advertising world has always done a pretty good job of putting its own voluntary practices and compliance rules and also dispute resolution forums for anything that's advertising related. And most of you have probably heard of the National Advertising Division and we all know the Better Business Bureau. Those are organizations that help the industry voluntarily have a hand in enforcement. And then third of all, particularly when it comes to data privacy, AI, a lot of the technology tools that you all use every day are well, not starting, they've been doing this for a while, but they're continually evolving their own tech tools, um, and requiring parties to use them to use the tool. And many of them are compliance focused as well. So it's kind of a combination of rules and it can be a puzzle to figure out sometimes. So, with that, we're going to discuss what we perceive to be the top five ad and compliance issues affecting the work you all put out into the world right now. First up is influencer marketing. Samantha, over to you to take it away on influencer marketing.
Yes, one of the more exciting topics, given how fast it's moving and how all of the different AIs and technologies and platforms are changing things nowadays. So I wanted to go over just a few of the compliance burdens that we're seeing come up often, especially given some trends in FTC enforcement. That way it can be on your radar and we can also answer any questions you have about it. So first compliance burden that we see a lot that you guys are very familiar with is the clear and conspicuous disclosures. What's changing about this, though, is how platforms are constantly changing their formats. Like, for example, Instagram is different now. And also, when you're reposting from Instagram to Facebook and Facebook to TikTok, there are so many ways for those disclosures to get lost. And so the FTC is really cracking down on where they're placed and how prominent they are across multiple platforms. The second compliance burden is going to be substantiating claims from influencers. So this isn't one that we've seen much up until this point, but it is becoming more and more common for the FTC to really crack down on what the influencer is actually saying. So, whereas before you can maybe get away with, it's obvious the influencer is being paid and this is their genuine experience, they're starting to really crack down more on, is it their genuine experience or are they just being paid to say something nice? So it's something to keep aware of. And then lastly, the compliance burden of monitoring influencer behavior, which is a constant for you guys if you're working with influencer work, where it's almost like chasing a toddler. You never quite know what they're doing or where it's coming from, but you have to stay on top of them. And one of the biggest reasons, as I move into FTC enforcement actions, is that they are starting to extend accountability more and more to agencies. So it's kind of like a parent and child. If a child knocks something over in the store, sure, the child's in trouble, but really the parent was the one that should have been watching them. So they're starting to look to agencies and brands more and more for accountability. They were also focusing on disclosure visibility, like we talked about, but more and more they're also starting to scrutinize hashtags. So the hashtag ad, hashtag sweepstakes, hashtag whatever is becoming less and less allowable. You now have to start being a little bit clearer in what you're disclosing. You have to say hashtag ad with Coca-Cola, something very specific as to what you're doing. And my notes. And
Sorry.
A little bit more enforcement around influencer claims, like we talked about. So it requires a lot more monitoring on your part to make sure that the influencer is having a genuine experience with the product or service that you're advertising. So to reduce your legal risk, we have a few quick tips. First one being create platform-specific disclosure guidelines for your team and also for the influencer. So, a lot of you guys have this, and we see this a lot, and they're really well done, where it's YouTube, this is the type of content, this is where the disclosure goes. Instagram, Facebook goes here. If it's translating from one app to another, it needs to be here. There's also lots of helpful resources from the FTC itself about where these disclosures should be placed. Second, we would recommend providing influencers with a do and don't list about claims made. This can help avoid any sort of unsubstantiated claims or false claims that could give rise to an FTC action. And then lastly, we recommend, as far as monitoring influencer behavior goes, we recommend implementing a structured workflow to establish correction procedures. So who's monitoring the posts when they go up, who's checking them for compliance with FTC regulations, who's contacting the influencer, do you have access to their account, so on and so forth. So a lot of our recommendations for this are just going to be having really clear guidelines and procedures, because we know how fast you guys move and how fast influencers move. And so having these almost second nature muscle memory can be really helpful for avoiding these FTC issues.
Yeah. It also helps you with the real time reaction if something goes sideways because it's better for you to be in partnership with your brand in terms of knowing if there's an issue versus them having to make that call to you and having to have that difficult conversation. It's not always possible, but it's optimal. So I'm having these as sort of a pathway and laid out in advance so that you're not surprised if something happens to go sideways, and you can immediately focus on reacting to it or fixing it versus, how you're going to manage the client's reaction as well as fixing the compliance problem at the same time. All right. Most of you are involved at some point in some sort of direct response or some sort of outbound marketing tactic, which involves the use of data and particularly customer or consumer data. And that invokes data privacy, legal compliance. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we don't have a federal standard in the United States, unlike in the EU or in other nations where this is federally regulated. In the United States, we don't yet have a federal law governing data privacy and the do's and don'ts. And frankly, despite on behalf of all of you not wanting a lot of extra laws for you to have to all pay attention to, I would personally welcome a federal standard here so that you all could manage to one set of rules instead of 50 sets of rules, which is where we are right now in the US. So, in terms of your compliance burdens, this can be tricky because in most cases, in our experience, the data is not coming from you and you are not procuring it. It's the brand who's giving you the data that they have accumulated over time. And you're not always able to know what the provenance of that data is and how it was collected. And so it can be a bit tricky to work through. In terms of some of the major compliance burdens that are on your brand clients and also on you as their agency, is making certain that there are privacy policies that are up to date, accurate, and clear to a consumer. Um, this is really a partnership between you and the brand because these are the brand's privacy policies, and you are in a strong position to make recommendations about them. But ultimately, it's going to be up to the brand to adopt them and also get them blessed by their legal counsel. But we want this on your radar as something you need to be thinking about, asking about when you have discussions with your clients, and ideally before, you put product out into the world that involves directly contacting a consumer or using their data in any way. Secondly, as I alluded to a moment ago, a compliance burden for you, the agency specifically, is again, you're not in control of sourcing the data. And so um, you need to be prepared to ask questions about what the origin of the data was, whether it was obtained from any third parties, if the client obtained it, how they generally do so. Did they collect names at a trade show booth? Which is still a thing, even though it feels very analog and retro, but it's still where a lot of um, data originates because that data ends up being put into a CRM, which ends up folded into some other system, which then makes its way to you when you put a campaign out into the world. And then scanning your environment. And by that, I mean, a lot of times I think agencies, because their clients tend to have a bias in this direction, assume that they maybe don't have to concern themselves with regulations in parts of the country where they are not targeting for purposes of creating a business result for their client. Well, our client doesn't have stores on the West Coast, or our client is only in the South. It is about where the consumer resides in terms of determining which privacy regulations will comply. It's not about where your client sits, and it's not about where you sit or where the communications originate. It is about the consumer whose data is being used. So scanning in advance to understand the scope of a product of a campaign or a tactic, and understanding that you got to play to what we would consider still the gold standard in terms of privacy legislation in the United States. So moving over to the trends section of the slide here. Um, we still consider California the gold standard when it comes to regulating data privacy. They have the most impactful and most well established, and also arguably the strictest set of rules when it comes to protecting consumer privacy. So your safest strategy is always going to be playing to the compliance requirements of the California state law. That said, Maryland is giving California a run for its money. They have enacted new data privacy legislation effective October 1st that rivals California for strictness in some case. And what some of these state laws are doing are not only giving regulators the ability to take action if they don't like what they see when it comes to data use, but there's a lot of pressure to give consumers a private right of action against a brand or whomever's in the food chain. And that can mean class action lawsuits, that can mean individual lawsuits, which is a whole different ballgame than dealing with a regulator. So we've seen enforcement increase at the state level. There are over 20 states now with laws in effect, and there's 12 more states that have just passed laws in the United States touching data privacy in some way, shape, or form. Again, still no federal law, so be aware of that. So, things we want you to think about doing include have a well-written privacy policy. Use your agency as its own guinea pig, as its own practice. Consider having a templated version of a privacy policy that you can suggest or recommend to your brand clients. It's not your job to be their legal counsel, and in most cases, they are going to have to run this by their own legal advisor, which is appropriate. But it can put you all a step in the right direction and make things a little faster if they've got something to react to. And it also positions you as a leader in this area when it comes to interacting with your marketing team, colleagues, as well as their legal counsel. Secondly, have a plan in advance before the campaign makes its way out into the world about how primarily your client is going to handle requests that come in from consumers about their data. There are specific requirements in some of the state rules that say you've got to respond to a consumer who wants to know what data you have of theirs. You've got to respond to a consumer who asks you to delete their data. How is that going to happen? What's the plan? How does a consumer make his or her desires known to the brand, and what is the obligation there? So think about how consumer data inquiries would be handled once the campaign goes live. And then have conversations with your clients about where their data came from. Um, this is admittedly not a fun task for your team members to have to do. And also, and we're going to talk later on in the session about how to protect the agency legally from responsibility in this area. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be asking questions about how do you collect your data, and do you buy data from third-party sources? Have you purchased leads? Have you purchased lists? Um, which I'm hopeful that you're all advising your clients not to do, and I'm hopeful none of you are doing it because it's not a safe practice anymore, in my view. But ask questions. Where'd the data come from? All right, let's talk about reviews because this is a tactic we are seeing used with increasing frequency. It's very effective. Consumers want to know what other consumers think about your client's products. They're more likely to trust another purchaser than they might be to actually trust ad copy or sometimes even influencer marketing. And so, and you'll see an interplay between reviews and testimonials and sometimes influencer or creator campaigns. But FTC is very involved in letting the industry know what it considers acceptable practice when it comes to reviews. And I don't put that slide in here. So, all right, apologies. You'll get the accurate you'll get the accurate slide in your deck when we send it out. I don't know how that happened. So what the FTC wants to know is whether you are talking about a typical unexpected experience. They want to know, did the consumer actually use the product? How did they get the product? Were they compensated in any way? This is a huge area of risk because if the consumer submitted a review as part of a contest, or if they received a free product and reviewed it, or if they are not speaking from their own experience or a typical experience, the FTC is very sort of on its pins and needles right now about this. It also, the FTC is focused very highly, in some states as well, who have their own regulations about this. They are focused on wanting to know if you're only publishing positive reviews and cherry picking them. You're not allowed to do that. You've got to publish the good and the bad. They are concerning themselves with how are the reviews displayed? What does the interface look like? Are you burying bad reviews so that they're only seeing the cream of the crop and not bothering to scroll down? The equivalent of what would have been third page Google results back when before we were focusing on AI for our search versus Google. Um, these are the tactics that they are concerning themselves with. And they're also, so a couple of things I want you to think about doing. You should make sure that if there are any methods of compensation given to a product reviewer, that the reviews are only displayed, especially if they're on your own platforms, with full disclosure. This reviewer entered a contest. I was shopping at Macy's online, and every product review, it seemed like 50% of them was submitted in response to a contest. So, so that's okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's helpful to know that because that may or may not impact what a consumer believes about the review when they see it. Um, you want to make certain that the brand understands that suppression of reviews is not permissible. You want to talk to the brand and make sure they understand that you cannot give a consumer a different online experience based upon whether they leave a good or bad review on your clients' websites or platforms. We've seen some cases where we haven't personally seen them, fortunately. None of our clients have done this, but we've seen case law around circumstances where the interface that a positive product reviewer receives on a product's website is different than the one a negative one receives. That's called gating, and the FTC doesn't want you to do it. So, as reviews increase as a tactic, we want you to understand that there are conversations you want to have with your clients about the fact that this needs to be transparent, disclosures need to be made. And the idea at the end of the day is so that anybody looking at these reviews gets a very accurate picture of where they came from and how trustworthy they might be. All right, let's talk about. I just returned from an ad law conference, and this was an extremely hot topic. Um, Using telephone tactics to market, whether it's robocalling or text marketing. You know what? I'm going to exit this slide deck because obviously, I am sorry, everybody. Obviously, we put the wrong version of the deck up. And so hold on, give me 1 second to swap it out with the correct one. Samantha, talk while I'm switching our deck. This is a first,
Yeah,
everybody. This is a first
yeah,
for
this is
me.
the first. No, Sharon had everything all perfectly set up this
I
morning,
did.
and now,
This
yeah.
is real time, everybody.
Well, while she's doing that, where is everybody from?
Yeah.
Everybody put in your state and
Why
city,
don't we
please.
take a few
Curious.
questions, actually? If anybody wants to populate a question in the comment window while I get this reset. And Kayla, if you've got any questions that were submitted prior, um,
I do.
let's do that then while I work on this.
one second to pull them up. Sorry, guys, my internet is not wanting to cooperate.
Well, I know one of the questions that got asked was,
Here, Sharon, why don't I just run the,
yeah, is whose responsibility is all of this? Oh, good. Thank you.
yeah, I will get this pulled up here. And
Jacob's got a question. Kayla, could you read
Yeah,
that?
yeah, Jen also. Jen wants to know, can you say more about the concerns around purchasing lists? Does it depend on the source or is this all lists overall?
I just don't like the practice anymore because there's just no way to assure provenance, and any broker that you get a list from is um, not going to be able to stand behind the provenance of it either. And so it's just very risky. A lot of it is old data, which means it may not be effective, first of all, but I'm not as concerned about that as I am about the fact that if that data has been sitting around for a while, pre-compliance rules, that it's not going to be compliant. Thank you, Samantha.
mhm.
Um, so my biggest concern is that you've got data there aggregated from multiple places and sources, because this is what list brokers do. They find it in multiple places and mash it together. That it's not vetted and that they're not going to stand behind it. And that even if they say they'll stand behind it, that's not going to be very helpful to you if you can't prove where a consumer's data came from. So I am just in the camp of, for not only for data privacy rule compliance, but also telephone and text marketing compliance. Um, Buying lists just doesn't feel safe to me. And I've been saying that for a couple of years, but I feel until I feel strongly that that list brokers have caught up with data privacy rules, which I don't expect to happen. It's just a tactic that we would advise our clients to stay away from. That's just a personal point of view of mine, based on experience, um, and our desire for our agency clients to avoid risk in these situations. All right. Thank you, Jen, for your question. Jacob will answer your question too. So, as I just said, lead source compliance is something we're always worried about. And it's important to know that there are, just like data privacy, and even though we have a federal law that governs telephone communications, many states have their own mini rules as well about this. Um, I learned earlier this month that class action lawsuits under the TCPA, which is the federal statute for telephone communications practices, have doubled in each of the past 2 years. That means we're seeing 4 times as many now than we did 2 years ago, class actions. I want you all to know that there's no definite agreement yet among courts about whether texting is treated the same as robocalling. There are 3 appellate courts that have held that they should be treated similarly. There are 3 appellate courts that have held that texts are not the same as robocalls, either because they're easier to ignore, they're perceived as less annoying or interruptive, et cetera, et cetera. So, also the revocation rule, which means that when a consumer says, stop, don't text me, don't call me, don't have a computer call me, um, that's in limbo right now, meaning potentially that a consumer might tell you to stop calling them, and that might not mean you have to stop texting them or vice versa. We don't know where that's going to land, but for right now, your clients should be assuming, and you should be assuming on their behalf, that stop means stop. If they've stopped you from one form of communication, you should be stopping all forms of communication. So consider doing these things to reduce your risk. Don't purchase leads unless you can do so from brokers who claim that they are 100% TCPA compliant, in which case there's a higher degree of safety you might be able to feel about the fact of whether they're complying with data privacy rules as well. For now, the safest thing to do is assume that the TCPA applies not only to telephone calls and robocalls, but also to texts. And if your agency does not specialize in these tactics, then you should be partnering with an agency that does from a compliance perspective. These are cases, some of these class action suits, these are business enders for some of your clients and even perhaps an agency here and there. We haven't seen an agency get sued for this yet, at least I'm unaware of one, but we have seen cases that have put businesses out of business because of the cost of either satisfying a judgment under one of these or defending it. So just be aware that this is floating out there, and there are some things in limbo, but consumer privacy is being very jealously guarded by regulators on a number of fronts, and this is one of them. All right, Samantha.
Right. So we're moving into the use of AI generated content and ad compliance issues. So I attended a CLE yesterday about this, and in summary, Madeline on our team and I both agreed that nobody really knows anything right now, but we have to pay attention to what we do know. And so the first thing that we really look at is transparency and disclosure. And we look at that from the perspective of what the FTC might look at in the future whenever they're starting to produce more AI generated regulations or AI focused regulations. Mm-hmm. And so when you're using AI within your campaigns, you know, little uses might be okay. You might not need to disclose those, but if it substantially impacts the way a consumer views your advertisement or your materials, then that's something that you should probably disclose. So for example, if you're using an AI generated model and that model looks a certain way after using your client's shampoo, you probably need to disclose that you have used an AI generated model. And then we also have some compliance burdens with regards to IP ownership of outputs. That's something that if you've worked with us before, you know we talk about at length, because right now copyright law does not give ownership in those raw generated deliverables. And so in order to ensure that your clients own what they expect to own and you own what you expect to own, you have to really pay attention to and document what is being generated by those AI platforms. And lastly, one of the biggest issues that's being discussed right now, both in law, but also by platforms and just, you know, in society in general, is ensuring accuracy, substantiation, and ethical use of AI in marketing and advertisements. So that means, as you'll probably heard before, you cannot just generate something and toss it out there for the world to see. There has to be some level of human involvement to ensure that things are accurate and that they're ethical, that they're not perpetuating stereotypes or putting harmful information out into the world. And as you can imagine, your burden there, your responsibility is going to be higher the more impactful your product is. So for example, you're putting medication out into the world, you had better be really reviewing that AI generated stuff in detail. If you're putting out into the world tissue paper, maybe not as much of a review, still important, but not as heavy of a burden as if you're putting out something like medication. And then all of those being burdens that are now being brought up in regulations. So states like Utah, California, and Colorado are starting to put out some state level regulations, which for your own safety and liability purposes, I would assume that most of these are you just assume that they apply to everybody, because you can't control where your ads are going necessarily. It's on the internet, anyone can access them. So someone from California, someone from Colorado, someone from Utah can all access the same ad. And so I would really ensure that you understand these laws, which typically require disclosure when you are using synthetic performers or synthetic content that may lead a consumer to believe something other than that there is an actual person on their screen telling them something. So we can definitely go more into that in detail, but these laws are pretty new and there's lots of laws waiting in the wings in all of these other states that we're going to have to be aware of over time. And related to that, there's still no federal legislation governing ownership. There's no federal legislation governing AI use in general, but certain states are starting to clarify what can and cannot be owned, at least under state law. So, for example, certain states like Louisiana are allowing automatic ownership of AI prompts. So whoever creates it gets the prompt. Also, with generated content, whoever creates it might get ownership in that deliverable. So we have to be really aware of what those states are saying so that if you do produce something in a certain state, you have your contracts aligned to make sure that whoever needs to own something owns it. And then last of all, there's an overall trend of disclosures from platforms. So Meta and TikTok and all of these other platforms are starting to require disclosures, even if the law itself doesn't require it. So it's important to stay on top of those trends and to understand what the platforms are requiring of you so that you don't break their laws, because they could just take the content down. And then lastly, the things you can do to reduce your legal risk here. Number one, develop a disclosure playbook for AI content. It can be something like a range of, this type of AI content is delivered, then we need to have this type of disclosure, all the way to, okay, if this type is delivered, we have to have thorough review, we have to have all these disclosures, we have to make it prominent, so on and so forth. We also recommend using an AI use log so that there's clear distinction of who owns what and what was created by AI, what was created by your team, what was brought on by the client. That way, as these laws continue to develop, you have clear direction as to what was created by AI and what was not. We also recommend reviewing platform terms or having us review them. More likely, that's what's going to happen. And we have reviewed several of them. And these platforms have different clauses on who owns what, especially based on what type of account you have. So it's important to really delve into those terms and understand how that impacts your ownership and your liability, especially moving forward with these laws. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, based on what we have seen, is having an AI policy and procedure document that you share with your team that everybody has to follow. That way there's safe vetting of AI platforms and processes from start to finish. And what's not on here is just talk to your lawyers, talk to your peers, because we are all learning about this together. And we are all taking these laws as they're coming in. And so the more we communicate and help each other, the more we're going to have safe and ethical use of AI that also helps you get the job done.
Yeah. This is changing quickly. This probably the area of regulation that is most likely to look completely different a year from now than it looks today. And then I would just throw in here as well. Some of you might work with brands who are signatories to the SAG-AFTRA agreement, and I want to remind you that AI and AI generated likenesses and AI generated content were significant stumbling blocks that caused the actors strike and the writers guild strikes. And so there are, if SAG-AFTRA compliance is part of your world because you work with brands who are signatories to it, there are very specific AI policies that you need to be aware of so that your brand's not violating its obligations as an advertiser under any of those. We don't have time to get into those. We're happy to answer questions about them, but that as much as these compliance rules are a factor, your contractual obligations under those agreements are also a factor. All right, there's a few issues we want to go through really quickly that are what I call evergreen, which means that they've been in place, they'll be in place. They are sort of fundamental linchpins of the regulatory landscape for the work that you're putting out there. And let's talk about the main one, which is what does the FTC say about what advertising needs to be and or cannot be, and what's considered advertising? And the short answer to that question is just about everything you all are doing is considered advertising. If it's put out there with some sort of commercial intent to create some sort of business result, whether it's a sale or to take an action, the FTC is interested in looking at it, and as far as they're concerned, it is advertising, and there are basic principles that you need to be aware of regardless of your tactics. First of all, claims need to be truthful and they need to be clear, and those are not the same things. Truthful means accurate, obviously, but clear means not likely to mislead somebody on the receiving end of the claim. And you can figure out if you look at who the audience of a claim might be, whether or not that's a higher burden to sustain versus a lower burden. If your audience is vulnerable, like a child or a senior or someone with a disability, the FTC is going to take that into consideration. Secondly, it's great that if everybody feels good about a claim and that it's truthful, but does your client have the substantiation to prove that claim if they were ever required to do so? This is a big part of where claims fall apart when an FTC or an NAD or a BBB investigation occurs, which is, do you have any proof for what you put in that advertising or in that marketing piece? So proof and substantiation are huge compliance obligations. Um, I mentioned vulnerable audiences. Obviously, if you are directing a claim towards a vulnerable audience, or as Samantha mentioned a moment or two ago, if you are working for clients in industries that have a higher compliance burden, like pharmaceuticals and healthcare, financial services, um, those are securities and investments. Those topics have an additional layer of regulation in terms of marketing. And most agencies who work in those spaces are aware of that, but that's an additional layer of compliance for you to be thinking about. And then making the right disclosures and disclaimers at the right time, in the right place, and in a visible fashion are burdens that are just kind of bread and butter for all of you who work in this space. So, what we want you to understand is the FTC does do the bulk of relevant rulemaking, but as I mentioned earlier, there are other organizations that are really are self-policing mechanisms in the advertising industry. And what we didn't include on the slide is that there are specific other agencies, like such as the SEC or the FDA, who also have their rules that need to be complied with if you're in those spaces. And there's are specific rules for marketing to children. COPPA is a very specific set of rules about addressing children as audiences. And then there are states that have their own specific regulations. And I think I saw a question pop through a second or two ago about how are you supposed to stay on top of a lot of these? And I'm not going to lie, it's a challenge. You've got to play to the strictest standard when it comes to state rules, and just be careful about the claims that you're making, the disclaimers you're using, and keep your audience in mind as well. So reduce your risk by doing some of these things. Verify the accuracy and the truthfulness of claims. You need to be partners with your clients in this because obviously they're feeding you the product data. They're telling you what their research and surveys indicate. So you need to be clear about getting their verification as every step along the way. Secondly, have conversations about the data and substantiation that your clients have on hand. Ask the question. If somebody were to ask about where we got this information or how we're able to make this claim, whether it's a comparative advertising claim or whether it's a performance claim, do we have the data to support this and can we see it? I mean, you should not be shy about asking about that in certain situations. And then make sure that you are using very clear and understandable language so that you're avoiding any claims of potential puffiness or saying things about a product or a service or a brand that could be misinterpreted. All right.
Okay, next up we have trademark and copyright compliance, which I'll go through pretty quickly because we want to have lots of time for questions. Keep seeing the chat thing pop up. Okay, first main compliance burden from a copyright perspective is music and creator brand and personal accounts. This is a very common issue that we see where somehow music has gotten onto a post on social, either from an influencer or from an agency or from the brand that is not licensed for that purpose. And so we want y'all to understand that whenever you select an account type that you're posting from, that is tied to a specific set of music and licensing terms. And it doesn't matter if I'm a business and I select a personal account, that doesn't mean it's okay for me to use all of the music on my personal account because I'm a business. Okay, so it's safest to assume that the music that you can use when you're advertising on behalf of a client is going to be the music available in a brand account or music that you appropriately license from an artist. So I know that's like an issue that's often debated in agencies as to, oh, this is available in the creator account and we're using an influencer, so it's fine. It's not always fine. You always have to check those fine print terms. Second compliance issue slash just a general issue that we see a lot is that, but everyone else is doing it, so why can't I? It I would just remind you guys that just because you see a large brand doing something or multiple large brands doing something does not mean that their lawyers have not been working all night for the last week dealing with the repercussions of what that brand chose to do. So just because you see it does not mean that it's acceptable for you to do. And it's always a good idea to make sure that you run it by legal or by your supervisors, just to make sure that something is actually legally permissible. And then the last thing that I wanted to address was influencer accidental theft of property. So, influencers are often very young and they don't have a lot of experience, and they might incorporate music or video clips, or they might involve their friends in these types of videos that they're making for you. But they have to have licenses, releases, permissions, etc., to be able to use all of that in their content. So, like we talked about earlier with the FTC cracking down more on agency oversight, this is an area where we really recommend that when you're talking to your influencer, did you get a release for this person? Where is this content coming from? All those questions, you can no longer just assume that the influencer has cleared it. And so to reduce your legal risk, we recommend having a cheat sheet of the music rights for each account type. That way you have very clear metrics on what you can use and what you cannot use. We also recommend always conducting your own due diligence, no matter what other brands are doing. Even brands in your own industry, we still recommend that you have your own diligence process and not just assume that it's safe to do. And then lastly, we recommend having a very specific procedure for auditing the content that your influencer delivers to you. So nothing crazy, but just making sure that they have all licenses in place, all releases, etc., so that the content you can feel confident is going to be safe to put out there into the world.
Yeah.
And then related to that, publicity rights and releases. So the compliance burdens that we're seeing nowadays are AI generated likenesses. So that means you generated an image of Taylor Swift and she's now promoting your laundry detergent. Second is influencers failing to obtain proper releases, which we just talked about. And then we have patchwork publicity laws across multiple states. So every state recognizes a different level that a person has in their rights of publicity. So that means my right to use my face, my voice, my name, my handle, etc., to promote a product. So all the states are different. We're hoping that there will be some sort of comprehensive federal legislation, but I've also been saying that for 10 years now, so it doesn't seem likely anytime soon. So principles to understand: copyright is not the same as publicity. This is something that gets confused a lot. So just because you get rights to a video from your influencer does not mean that you have rights to be able to use their face across the country. Those are two separate releases. You always have to get them both. Value can be attached to name, image, likeness, and the handle. So don't just think it's like, oh, their face, or it's, oh, their video, whatever it is. It can also be attached to just their notoriety, their name, their signature. If you see, I use Taylor Swift again, Taylor Swift's signature is placed on a laundry detergent product, I personally am more likely to buy it. And unless she authorized that signature, then it's not okay for the laundry detergent brand to use that. Likenesses can still infringe on rights of publicity. So similar. So if you have someone similar to a celebrity or an influencer who people might think is that celebrity or influencer, that's still an unauthorized use of their likeness. And then lastly, keep in mind that everyone featured in the content may have a right of publicity, depending on the state that they're in. Always safest to assume that they do, and then you can get the releases accordingly. So to reduce legal risk, be comprehensive in your reviews of the content that you have and ensure you have releases for every participant. Don't use anyone's likeness without permission, and ensure content featuring a person has both a copyright and a publicity release.
Awesome. All right. So how should you talk to your clients about all this? Because, this is what can feel like an intimidating or overwhelming patchwork of things to have to be thinking about. And also, there's the fact that you all are agency professionals and creators and creatives. You're not lawyers. And so, how do we have this conversation with our clients? So, a couple pointers for you. Thank you.
What switches too? Is this
All right.
it?
Are we missing some slides here too?
It looks like it, yeah.
All right. All
Unfortunately.
right. So I'm just going to talk
Yeah.
about this loosely. And again, the deck that you get will have the correct slides in it. And I apologize for that. So the conversations to have with the client really are a function of establishing the partnership between you and your marketing counterparts, and then helping them establish the partnership with their own legal advisors, who are going to require that they defer to them in these areas. And it's important, therefore, that you give them the leverage that they need and the information that they need to have these conversations. And so, first of all, it's really sharing any risk assessment that you've done internally with them, and really treating it as part of the workflow, right? As much as you would be running concepts by them for approval from a creative direction and also a strategic direction, the earlier you can do sort of an assessment of any questions that you might have about legal issues that the campaign creates, helps them and gives them cover to go to their legal team and say, hey, this has been flagged, and agency's legal thinks these might be issues, and so we would like your help with assessing them as well. Um, and then finally, there are definitely some areas in your client contracts that you need to be thinking about addressing these. First of all, your liability and indemnification provisions should make the client responsible for compliance at the end of the day. And that only makes sense if you do it in combination with requiring them to approve everything before it goes out into the world. And so it's going to sound a little unfair in their ear to their ears to make them responsible for anything that goes sideways without also dictating the expectation that they should be reviewing everything that goes out under their brand name into the world. And so having that conversation and reflecting that as well in the client contract is going to be very important. Finally, any third parties you're working with, let's use influencers as an example. The influencer agreement that gets put out into the world with whatever creator or influencer is engaged to do its work should very clearly put responsibility in their corner for the content that they put out from a disclosure perspective, from an accuracy perspective, etc. Any data warehouse that you are using or data processing vendor should have a clear understanding and dictated in the agreement between your agency and them about who's going to be responsible for data privacy compliance, for example. So there needs to be a waterfall between what the client's expecting of the agency and what the agency expects of the third-party vendors. And then there needs to be clear conversations about issues that get flagged and who is going to be responsible for them. And so there'll be some pointers in your deck about them, but Samantha, why don't you put the deck back up really quickly and go to the last page with the QR code. We're going to take questions next, but there's a resource center that I want you all to have access to with some free tools in it. There you go. Um, about compliance with ad regulations. There's a really great FTC compliance handbook as one of them. And also with some information there about those of you who might need a done for you, a sort of a done with you approach to doing these regulation reviews for campaigns before they get to the client. So check out that resource center and obviously download anything that's in it. It's all free to you. And with that, I think let's turn to some questions. Let's see. Kayla,
Ready?
do you want to
Yeah.
read the questions for us? Yeah.
Yes. So Jacob wants to know, we do a lot of customer testimonial videos. We are obviously trying to select the stories that paint the best picture of the brand. Is this cherry picking?
Samantha, what do you think? Is that cherry picking?
That's a tough question. I mean, I'm thinking if it alters the overall impression of the campaign, which might have already been negative, let's say like you pick the three good reviews out of 100 bad ones, then yes, that would be cherry picking. But if you have 100 good reviews and three bad ones and you pick good reviews, I would think that that would be not cherry picking based on recent reviews anyway. Sharon, you might have a different impression of that.
Yeah, well, I think I slightly do. I think testimonials create involve some creative direction and also some curation and selectivity. It's a little bit different than using reviews because those are all being submitted by consumers who, aren't being coached in advance about what to or shouldn't be coached in advance. I think there's a higher degree of expectation that when you're putting a testimonial on a website about a product,
Hmm.
that you're going to want to paint a positive picture of the brand and its products and services. So I think the risk is lower with testimonials, Jacob, than it would be for using reviews as a tactic to garner interest in your client's products or services. So I don't feel like the guardrails are quite as tight. You should never put any content out there, obviously, that you don't feel is representative of the truth and also of the truthful experience of whoever's speaking about the product or service. But the FTC is a little bit more concerned about reviews because of the volume of them and because of the way they're displayed in aggregate. And so I think that's how I feel about that.
Um,
Hopefully it helps.
excuse me. Leslie is asking, as compliance practices continue to be updated, do we need to go back to influencers who may no longer be in compliance and ask them to retroactively update their posts to meet new compliance standards?
Are the posts still being monetized? Because if that's the case, then I would. But I believe we've seen recently that you don't have to go back multiple years ago and correct something that wasn't done appropriately. But if it's active and generating any sort of um, leads or product purchases for your client, then yes, I would definitely update it.
And to add to that, she's also asking, and can we add any language in our contracts with the influencers to put the burden of being FTC compliant more on them, especially if the posts are on their personal pages?
Well, yes, you can put whatever you want in the contract, is the short answer. And you can place burden on the influencer, but the FTC is not going to care as much what that contract says. They're going to say, were you supervising this individual who did this thing? And they're going to point fingers at you and at the influencer and at the brand. So the contract is helpful, but really managing the influencer and making sure you've got a reasonable level of oversight, that's what's going to help you the most.
Right. But absolutely put that language in your influencer
Yes.
agreements. It's, in my opinion, it sets the tone at the beginning of the engagement about what you expect of them. And so Samantha's 100% accurate that as far as the regulators are concerned, everybody in the food chain is responsible. But setting expectations with creators and influencers up front and their management too is a smart thing to do.
We have 1 minute left, and we have one more question. I think this would be a really great question to end on. Of course, if you have other questions that didn't get answered, feel free to email them to Sharon and Samantha. Both of their emails are in the slides, and I will add mine in the chat, and we will get those answered for you. And the last question, with laws being state specific instead of federal, how do we stay on top of this ever-changing landscape?
I'll share my impression, and Samantha, I would love your answer to this too. I think two things about this. I think, first of all, this is a poster child question for doing a real-time review every time you put a campaign out there. Because that review, the more immediately you do it before content or tactics go out into the world, the more recently the laws that affect it may have been enacted and the more fresh they are. So I think doing real-time reviews before every campaign goes out into the world is one line of defense there. Secondly, my generic advice is you play to the most conservative state, which is not something marketers like to hear, obviously. But from a risk management perspective, for your agency and also, for having your clients back, look to the most conservative state on an issue. If it's data privacy, California. If it's influencer marketing, New York and California. AI, New York, California, and maybe one or two more states Samantha might have an opinion about. But I think that immediacy and also playing to the strongest state law is the best way, the best shot you have at putting a compliant body of work out there. What do you think, Samantha?
No, that was going to be my main thing too. Is just California, the name was said multiple times. That's always a pretty good place to start with regards to getting your standard set of rules for yourself and your influencers. Yeah, that's generally my recommendations for clients because again, you can't control necessarily where the content is ending up. And it's best just to satisfy that highest requirement. That way you don't have to worry about it. So if we start with the lowest, and you start spilling out into other states and you have to go back and you have to go back and it's too much work for everybody, and as fast as things move, it's best just to start there.
Right. We can't thank you all enough for spending time with us today. A couple of housekeeping things. You will get the recording. We don't usually send our decks out. We're going to do that this time because obviously the one we had thrown up here was missing a couple of the corrected slides. And please, please visit the Resource Center because there's a lot of really good content there that you can use in your training archives and just to have handy. And the next time you're looking to put a campaign out there into the world. And always contact us if we can be helpful. If you need answers to any of these regulatory questions related to work you're putting out in the world or a conversation you need to have with a client about them. So thanks so much for your time today and look out for those follow-up resources and reach out to us if we can be helpful. Have
Thank
a
you,
great day,
everyone.
everybody. Bye.